You may get to wish upon a genie if you rub the Fragments of Silicon.
All right, welcome to another installment of Fragments of Silicon. I'm your host, Adam. Joining me as always are my compatriots, Gollix and Pettyfan. Well, let us do the weekly ritual in which we are ingrained to do. Petty, why don't you start us off this week?
Oh, God. This has probably been one of the tamest weeks in the last 2 months. I had, the really only things were important I need to deal with this week is I fixed the outlet downstairs. It works now, so hooray for no more sparks. Turns out it shattered internally, and that's where the sparking was coming from.
That's not good.
That is not good.
It's not good.
But yeah, it's resolved now. And hopefully it gets warm enough to test the air conditioner, because I replaced the thermal sensor in that. So hopefully we don't need to buy a brand new air conditioner, because I can live with replacing that thermal sensor every couple years, not buying a whole new large window unit every 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
As far as gaming goes, I actually got Ogre into playing the Digimon card game. There's a online simulator that we tried out, and that was enjoyable.
Just trying to fill the hole
on Tabletop Simulator, or
Tabletop Simulator is now defunct. There is a new, just purely browser-based one. I can send you the link for it later. But
sure.
Yeah, Tabletop Simulator is dead because, I mean, it makes sense. The dude wasn't making any money off of it, and he still had to put in the time and effort of building the actual card pieces.
You mean the Digimon module for Tabletop Simulator,
yes.
not Tabletop Simulator the game. Okay, that's what I wasn't sure about.
Yes. The actual card game module is no longer being updated, so after set EX6 for English, there's no more cards available. So, and also, I believe Ogre should be getting his new computer built next week. So
he's not going to help me out with that?
Yeah.
Thought so.
And yeah, there might be some co-op gameplay during the season interim, if that can come to pass.
I mean, we got a couple weeks.
Yep.
So
gotta work out the new rig, right?
I suppose.
And then yeah, as far as just gaming in general for me, I've been playing, what's that new? There's a new game that dropped on Game Pass. It's in the HD 2D style. Yuden Chronicles 100 Heroes.
Oh, Yuden Chronicles. That's the spiritual successor to Suikoden.
Yeah, and so far I've been enjoying it.
Been hearing mixed things. I picked up the prequel recently for $5.
I mean, it's also on Game Pass, so I imagine it probably, it's hard to have super negative opinion on a, pro thing I'm already paying for, and it just popped up on it. And yeah, I think that's it from me.
All right. You're up, Alex.
I don't think I have too much special going on this week. I'm going to start looking around to see if I can get a new laptop soon, so that I can, because there are a couple of potential trips coming up that would be nice to have for, plus the general, or at least possible trips coming up, plus the general not
Do you
working
need
so
an
great.
actual laptop, or would you be fine with like an Android tablet type thing?
I would really prefer to have a laptop.
Fair, because I know a lot of people nowadays, they don't really need a full laptop.
I know, but there are a lot of limitations to a Chrome box or whatever.
Or just like Android tablet, like, yeah, I can kind of see. Anyway.
Again, I still need to do some comparison shopping, and some of it will depend on how prices are. But
Yeah, that's partly why I brought that up, because a lot of decent Android tablets are cheaper than a decent laptop.
yeah, well, I'll think about it, but I do prefer to be able to like do a lot of multiple things at a time, and frankly, laptops or frankly tablets are generally significantly worse at that.
I guess, yeah, it's been a while since I had a tablet, since like 2015. But they could have also gotten better by then. It's not something I really need to use often, because desktop and not really leaving a lot.
Yeah. Anyway, it's something to think about. That's still been playing Splatoon 3. Still working. I think I said that I built the Gundam Aerial. Some of the other stuff that I got to go along with it arrived. So I built the Mirasol flight pack and also a few stands, because it'll be useful for comparison purposes.
Right.
Unfortunately, it now kind of wants me to. It now makes me kind of want to get some of the other things that it has adapters for the remote weapons of, but
God, it's like Barbies for guys, isn't it?
Well, and usually the thing that I do to limit limitation is I mostly get ones that I want to see how they work rather than just ones that I like the look of.
Right.
So yeah, and we're finally, I think tomorrow night we're supposed to go for dinner to the place that I wanted to go on my birthday.
Cool.
That was way too long of a wait. So
You
I'm looking
mentioned
forward
that.
to that, and I think that's about all I got.
All right, then. Now, I guess it's my go. Yeah, still dealing with this cold. It's mostly cleared up, but not quite. Hence the phlegm. Ugh. But yeah, most of my week has been dealing with the fallout from the accident. That's been harrowing, as you can imagine. And, I won't go into details here, but right now things are being assessed, and we're like, it's not official yet, but expecting totality to be the end result. I suppose on the good end of the equation, the other vehicle, turns out their damage was cosmetic.
Fun.
So, hooray for that, I guess. Anyway, in terms of gaming, when I've been able to do that, once again, it's been kind of busy around here. But, been playing the games for the week, and I've started up the Command and Conquer Remastered Collection. Like, yeah, that's bringing me back to the 90s. Like, oh, I'm like, very much so. Considering it's got original Tiberian Dawn and Red Alert in it. I'm like, anyway, yeah, not much else to discuss in the here and now. So, merrily we shall roll along to the interview portion of the broadcast. And we are welcoming to our program this week Adam Tierney of Wayforward.
Hey, how's it going, guys?
It goes well enough, I suppose. How are you doing tonight?
Pretty good. I had some dental work done earlier today, and I'm surprisingly not in pain. So that counting so far, that's going pretty good. Hopefully, that doesn't change.
Well, what sort of dental work did you have?
Oh, it was just one of my fillings came loose, and then so I had to go, and they had to redo it. According to my dentist, I guess, because I think that was a filling I got when I was much younger, and it was like one of like the old school like metal looking ones, and she said that basically over time the older fillings can shrink or grow and basically pop out of your teeth, and apparently that's what happened to mine. So now I've got like the nice modern enamel colored filling there.
Yeah, kind of porcelain based.
Yeah, exactly, and it looks and feels a lot more a lot better.
Right. So, how we like to get formally started here is we like to get to know the people behind the games, the studio, and all that business. And we start by asking this particular question: what got you interested in video games, both on a personal and a professional level?
So I have been at Wayforward almost just a few months shy of 20 years. And it's one of the only jobs I've had. I'm in my mid 40s, and so I was like very very young when I started there. I think I can't remember a time when I haven't been into video games. I had the NES as a kid. I actually had the 2600 Atari 2600 for a while, even after the NES came out. So a lot of my coworkers and friends are kind of their formative consoles were the NES or the SNES. A lot of the Atari 2600 kind of jumps around in my brain when I'm thinking of game designs and stuff. And I think that's because my brother and I were on that for probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 years or so, when other people had already kind of moved on to the NES. We kind of hopped on the NES a little bit after that. But yeah, the earliest memories, I remember playing that. I remember we had that console when we were little kids. I remember playing C64. I didn't have one myself, but the kids down the street had that, and that had some of my favorite games as well. So I can't remember a time when and then even before that, probably, like going to arcades as a kid and stuff. So I don't remember a time when I wasn't playing games. As far as getting into it, I went to UC Riverside, to cough, for English. And while I was there, I kind of got online into the hobby scene for Game Boy Advance development, started doing some pixel art, started doing some animation. And I remember that Matt Bozon, the creative director of Wayforward and creator of Shantae, we both used to hang out on the IGN message boards. And I remember posting one time, like, oh, I just got my first assignment as a pixel animator. And he said, oh, you live near us, you should come by. And so I visited Wayforward a few times and made friends there. And then I think like about a year later, I was working there initially as an animator, and then after about a year of doing all kinds of stuff, ended up directing projects. My first project was an X-Men game on Game Boy Advance around 2005 2006.
It might have been one of the X-Men Legend games.
This one was called X-Men the Official Game, and it was sort of the GBA tie-in to X-Men 3, except they didn't want to adapt it, so it's like an X-Men 2.5. So it was supposed to be like sort of following the events of X2, sort of before the events of X3, kind of jumbling all the stuff together. What I will say though is I was very proud, because I've been a lifelong comic fan. We were, I'm pretty sure, the very first video game to have X-23, the female Wolverine, in it. She had just come out in comics, and we asked if we could use her as a boss, and we got her in there. So I was very proud of that.
Yeah, I think I remember the console game. The X3, the official game, or whatever they called it. It was very forgettable, ironically enough.
Yeah, we were like, when I started at Wayforward, we were basically like the little brother, little sister game. So we never did any of the consoles, but if there was like a GBA version of something or a Nintendo DS version of something, Wayforward made a lot of those games. And it wasn't until I think Nintendo Wii that we started kind of graduating to doing more of the full-on console work. But yeah, for a long time, like a lot of we did Justice League Heroes, we did American Dragon, we did 4 different Barbie games. Like for a while, we kind of dominated the licensed handheld market.
Like, I think I remember an early Nintendo DS game called Ping Pals that Wayforward did. That was a curious beast.
That was just barely before I got there. I think they finished it like a matter of months before I started working there. And from what I was told, like, because everyone's like, why do you have that? Like, the Nintendo DS had that program. From what I was told, I think it was THQ was the publisher. Like, nobody knew that the Nintendo DS had a built-in chat program. So you basically had everybody rushing, all the publishers rushing to have launch products, and whoever the publisher was, I want to see THQ, but I'm not 100%. They basically said, "Hey, let's put together this chat app." The folks at Wayforward put it together very, very quickly. I think it was like 2 months or something like that, and released it. And then it was like, oh, it does the same thing that was on the system. However, so of course it was getting like 1 out of 10s and 2 out of 10s on the review scores. But I think I think it actually sold very, very well just because it was one of those launch window games, one of the first Nintendo DS games to ever come out.
Yeah, I think I've heard that as well. Right. Anyway, so I suppose I should ask, at what point did you shift to a more managerial role at Wayforward?
Yeah, it's been like a very slow kind of process. So it's funny. So I was hired as a pixel animator, and I worked on a couple games around 2004, 2005. Like I did a Batman Leapfrog game. I did worked on the Looney Tunes game. I worked on the Barbie games, and then I remember I was working under Matt Bozon. He was directing Sigma Star Saga, which was an original game we created for Bandai Namco, and I was an animator on that. I think I was doing animation and level design, and I basically asked him like, "Hey, we need like a bunch of enemies in this game. Could I design a couple enemies? I think that would be fun." And he said, "Sure." And then I think I immediately then designed like 50 enemies or something crazy like that. And I guess Matt saw in me, hey, there's potential for something beyond an animator. So over the course of that game, he gave me more and more responsibility, to where by the end of the game, my title was assistant director, which is basically like the assistant, the person right underneath the main director. And it was really cool. So I did most of the flight stuff in that game, if anyone's played it. So like most of the boss design and animation, and I worked with some of my friends from the hobby scene from a website called Pixelation, a bunch of people that later became very famous on their own in terms of pixel animators. Like a lot of people came out of Pixelation, like Paul Robertson and Joachim from Iconoclast, and Derek Yu from Spelunky. Like a lot of people from that time all kind of started there. But yeah, I slowly just kind of worked my way up and became assistant director on that project. And then after that, they gave me X-Men and Justice League and a whole bunch of other fun stuff after that. And then it was probably about a decade or so of just directing. But I was always one of the major. I did a lot of the pitches that we do, and what a pitch is basically in the context of games is when we want to do a game. Let's say we want to do like a new Batman game or something. We'll write up a document and produce some concept art for Warner Brothers or whoever has the IP, and try to convince them, hey, we're the right studio for the game. Hey, invest in us. Hey, partner with us. I did a lot of those on the side of directing, and so. Eventually, I ended up, I think about 10 years ago, taking over our biz dev department. So now whenever we there's a game we want to do, like for example, we just released Contra, Operation
Mhm.
Galuga with Konami. That would be a deal where I would have been talking with them and saying, hey, let's figure this out, let's make this work, getting all the contracts in a row and all that kind of stuff. So I took over BizDev about 10 years ago, and then just about 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, I also took over our publishing. So now, whenever Wayforward publishes a game, I'm sort of overseeing, handling that, doing the marketing, doing promotion, doing press, all that kind of stuff. Not really directing anymore, sadly, especially when I'm doing BizDev and publishing. It's hard to do that. I still get to write sometimes, though, which is fun. That's the thing that I like doing most within game development is writing the scripts, writing the dialogue. And the most recent time I got to do that, we just announced with Atari Yars Rising, which is coming out later this year. I got to write the script for that, which was a lot of fun.
Well, I mean, there's certainly a lot of ground here, given the actual time space you've mentioned. Like, I suppose a thing to ask is, did you ever expect that you'd be in the position that you are?
I think to some degree, yes. To some, no. So I think early on it was very evident that I liked writing pitches, that I liked working with partners like Warner Brothers and Bandai Namco, and trying to determine the games we work on and building those relationships. I think that was something that very early on I knew I was going to do. I didn't expect that I would do the more managerial stuff. So like a lot of my time now is like going through contracts as they're coming in, and coordinating with our lawyer on like deal terms, or putting together deal terms where it's like, oh hey, we want to do this game, so we need this much investment and you'll get this much return, and this is the recoup period. So all that sort of businessy stuff I never really imagined I would be a part of, but definitely the more creative bits where it's like painting a picture of like what is a Contra game from Wayforward, what is a DuckTales game from Wayforward. That's stuff that I think I've always wanted to do, and I think that definitely plays to my strengths.
I mean, it is a part of the business we don't speak about all that often on this program, mainly because we tend to get more people in the trenches, so to speak.
Yeah, it's interesting. The whole aspect of kind of just biz dev in general, I think most people just have no idea of. And the other thing that I think people would find fascinating is it is really hard to get a game funded and made nowadays. So for every Yars Rising or Operation Galuga that comes out, there's probably like 10 more games that we pitched. Some of them original, some based on classic IP that just never went anywhere. Where it's like, oh, we had a couple of meetings and ultimately couldn't get the funding. So I always joke that you could probably if you named like, oh man, I wish Wayforward would work on, and you named 10 brands, we probably have like existing pitches, existing like mock-up images or concept images for almost all of them, because whether it's based on classic games or whether it's based on an anime we love or a cartoon or whatever, we've pretty much pursued almost like everything that our creative teams are fans of at this point.
I mean, there's certainly a long legacy of Wayforward doing licensed games, not just kind of the faceless stuff that you were doing on like the GBA, but more recent stuff like, say, The Mummy Demastered.
Yeah, and I think the big shift for me since I took over BizDev is we always love doing licensed games. I mean, even something like River City Girls, that's a licensed game. It's a Kunio-kun license. We just kind of put our spin on it. Same thing with Yars Rising. We created some of the new characters, but it's still based on the Yars brand from the 2600. So I think we always love having that mix of original games and then also like licensed games and games we're reimagining. I think the big difference though is as we've gotten more and more success, and as we've had games come out that were really well received, it's allowed us to focus on the licenses that we're most passionate about. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with like a Barbie game or a SpongeBob game or a Shrek game, but those are not the games that our directors are really excited to spend a year of their life on. So that's why, it's my job now to line up the best opportunities possible so that the ones that come in, everybody is like, oh man, I can't believe we're working on that. And, that's definitely true, especially for the current round. Like I said, we just announced Yars Rising, but we've got a couple more that are going to be revealed over the next, couple months that I think are some of the best licenses, some of the best licensed games we've ever been a part of. So a lot of it's still secret, but a lot of the stuff being developed at Wayforward right now is some of the most exciting projects I've ever seen since I've been here.
How tantalizing. Of course, those are still in the dark, fortunately. So we can't really speak on that at this particular moment in time, but perhaps in the future. Though, that does get me to a question that I've been wanting to ask. I mean, do you still take on... I guess there's no soft way to put this, licensed games that may be perceived to just, being paid the bills. Like, as recently as 2020, you were working on games like Troll Hunters, Defender of Arcadia, and Bakugan, Champions of Estroya, which I'm sure were fine games in their own right, but I don't recall reviewing well and all that stuff.
Yeah, it depends. We're a very diversified studio, and I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of other indie, like mid-level indies like us have, studios have come and gone, but we've existed for, I mean, I've been here for 20 years, but the studio's been here for, I think, 35 years or coming up on it. I think it's because we're so diversified, because we have done all different kinds of stuff. I mean, we've even done, location-based entertainment, things like theme parks, things like theme park apps, things like cruise ships, educational software. We do like a little bit of everything, and I think that's helped us stay afloat. But yeah, again, like we're always open to that stuff. So kind of the two ways that a project can happen is we can go after an IP, a brand, and try and make a project happen, or somebody can come to us and say, hey, we want you to make this kind of game. And in the case of the latter, sometimes it will be stuff that we're not as passionate about, but if we still think that we would be a good fit for it, it's like, oh, okay, it's, like none of the directors are excited about that brand, but they've really got really good character designs. That would still be a good fit for us. We're always open to that stuff. But again, like we're trying to, as much as possible, or I'm trying to, as much as possible, doing the business development, make sure that all the brands that I bring in are somebody's favorite here. And I mean, definitely, you mentioned Troll Hunters. Troll Hunters was us like aggressively pursuing that. And that was, even though it's a kid's brand, it was because we're huge fans of Guillermo del Toro, and my kids were huge fans of the Netflix series, all three of the different series associated with that. So, what we go after, what we're excited about, isn't necessarily what is, specifically appealing to 20 to 30-year-olds and older. Sometimes we will go after the really younger IPs if it's something that is fascinating for us. One that I always wanted to do, and I was actually surprised that they just announced a movie of it, is I would have loved to have done a touchscreen Harold and the Purple Crayon game based on the kids' books. And I think we even investigated that and just, never made it happen. But yeah.
Like, I can't say I'm familiar with that particular property.
It's basically it's a kid's book where a kid gets a purple crayon and anything he draws comes to life. And I remember at the time I was saying oh, Nintendo DS, just let them draw purple creations and it comes to life. And that would have been the...
Nope, live action series 10 years later.
Is that what happened?
It's a movie. I just saw the trailer the other day. So it's, I think they did a cartoon back in the day that was really cute. I think it was like an HBO cartoon or something. But no, right now, I don't even think it's in theaters yet. Right now, they've got a movie with Zachary Levi, I think.
Yep, featuring the kid as an adult. And pretty much
Exactly,
every
yeah.
other warning sign of why would you do this with an adaptation of a children's property.
Yeah, I mean, again, I haven't seen the movie. Maybe it's great, but for me, when they adapted it for HBO, I think it was a decade or so ago, it was perfect. They just animated it exactly like the books, and it felt spot on.
I mean, I can't really comment because, like I said, it's not a property I'm familiar with. So, but anyway, but that does shine something that I always found interesting about Wayforward in, your sheer diversity, especially since, how do I put this? Wayforward has a certain image in people's minds. Like when people think of Wayforward, they think of, say, Shantae or Mighty Switch Force, that, and less a lot of the licensed stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of times they just don't even know we're behind that other stuff.
Possibly, unless they end up like purchasing it for one reason or another, or more likely they had to review it. Like I've seen that come up in reviews for the Thor game you guys did for the DS,
Yep.
Centipede Invasion.
Yep.
I
think what would maybe even surprise people even more is that about half the games out there made by Wayforward are 3D, because everybody associates us so heavily with either animation style 2D or pixel 2D, but we actually do quite a bit of 3D games as well.
This is true. I mean, now when you were doing more development work or directing, did you dabble in both? Or did you stick to 2D or 3D?
I did both. The first 3D game I did was I directed. This is again back before I did biz dev, so we didn't choose all the licenses. But the first 3D game I directed was called Shrek, Ogres, and Dronkies, and it was basically on Nintendo DS. And Activision said, "What if there was Nintendogs, but it was with Shrek babies?" And it's exactly like you would
That
imagine.
made my skin crawl.
Yeah, no, everyone hated it. It's actually a pretty decent game. Like the systems in it are really good. But no, I think people liked
You can have a
Nintendogs.
decent game, but a concept that makes a human skin crawl.
Yeah, I will say, like, what we did, like the AI in that is some of the most advanced AI of a game I've ever worked on. But again, it's just a game nobody wanted, so that's how it started. That was a rocky start. But no, later on, I got to work on our Silent Hill game. We did the super weird PSP Vita one, and then I got to work on a really amazing horror 3D game on for Amazon for mobile devices called Till Morning's Light. So I think most of the games I've worked on have been either all 2D or 2D characters, but yeah, there's definitely been some 3D stuff in the mix as well.
Good to know. Good to know. I mean, when was the last time you engaged in actual pixel work or 3D modeling or anything of that sort?
Oh geez. Well, I know the last time I sat down and did an animation was on Contra 4, which was the last Contra game we did, which was probably like 15 years ago, maybe even longer.
I think it was
I
a
think
Wii
I still have
title,
my
wasn't
copy
it?
of that.
It was a Nintendo DS.
Yeah.
So probably around like 2007, 2006, something like that. And I animated it's like a tradition in the game, the man-faced mutt. There's just this dog that has the face of a man. And so I animated him. He had about 4 animations. Oh, and then I animated we did in the Thor game that you mentioned. Actually, this was the last one. And I don't think that many people know about it. So if you do, it was some super weird, like sequence of events or something, but there was a battle mode, and if you played it in on a certain day in a certain mode or something like that, you could unlock Throg, the Thor frog. and I animated him. So if you play the battle mode and you get Throg, I think that was the last like full character I animated at Wayforward. And then since
yes,
then,
popular canon Marvel character Thor
yeah,
Frog. Frog.
and it was great because everybody else in the game was animated fairly realistically, but I made him bounce around almost like a Looney Tunes character. It was a lot of fun. But I have done pixel games as a director since then. So I directed Aliens Infestation was a really good one, and then I directed the first River City Girls game 5 years ago. So on those, I'm usually kind of hopping in and I'll tweak pixels or I'll like adjust things here and there. But yeah, I think Thor was the last time I worked top to bottom on a character doing their animation.
And do you miss doing like pixel work and that kind of deal?
I do, but I remember there was a game that we did after that. I think it was maybe it was an Adventure Time game or a regular show. It was one of those where I volunteered to do a character, and I remember sitting down. And it took me like over an hour to do the idle sequence, which is just how they animate when they're standing still, and it was just like, oh, this is too much work, I gave it back, and I was like, that was the moment I realized, yeah, I'm done as an animator. I'll just describe what I want from here on and let more talented people than me do it.
I'll just give the order and crack the whip, right?
Yeah, I do miss it though. I remember when I did assistant director on Sigma Star, I did a lot of the cinematic animations, and I did, I think, in the flight mode, every boss animation and every enemy animation. So I must have done 200 or 300, maybe even more animations on that game. That was when I was first starting. So I do miss it, even though I wouldn't choose to go back to it. But just like anything else in life, I do miss it from some aspect.
I mean, that makes sense. It's what got you in the door. But it's also nice that you're not so clouded that you make the actual jump back to it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm very happy with where I am right now, and more than anything, I really just love writing, and so that's why, in addition to business development and publishing, the one thing that I will tend to do game to game, whenever it's useful, is write the dialogue scripts, because that stuff is just so fun, especially since we've started working with voice actors. I think it's really helped elevate Wayforward's games to like a new level of charm than even what we had before.
Like, how recent was that?
Oh, I'm always doing that. So, like I mentioned, Yars Rising, we just announced that. I think Atari did last week as part of the Indie Direct. So I wrote the script for that. I'm writing the script for more River City Girls stuff that we're working on right now. Yeah, it's kind of the one thing that I can make time for, in addition to the management type stuff, and I'll always be willing to do that, even if it takes me, working on the weekends and stuff. I love writing dialogue for characters. That's my most fun aspect of game development.
And I suppose that does beg the question: how do you balance, writing with your managerial duties?
It just comes down to the deadline. So, you never run out of work on the publishing and biz dev side. That's why I really would have no bandwidth to like fully direct a game. I barely did it on the first River City Girls, and that was A, before I took over publishing, and B, with Ban and Rudis as my assistant director, like basically doing half the game alongside me. So writing is I'll just find out when the deadline is for something, and then I'll just make time. So usually it's like, okay, I'm going to spend all of next Tuesday just doing script. I will not be checking my emails. I'll just let everybody know, hey, I'm going to go MIA for a day or two. Usually you have to kind of do something like that. And I think that's kind of typical, even when I was directing games, and I know even the other directors at Wayforward, whenever you're doing like a big writing process, whether it's writing a script or writing the design document, which has all the gameplay described in it, usually people will kind of vanish for a few days and kind of, go into solitary to make that happen.
Okay. And has that changed any since you took over the biz dev, the publishing?
Just probably that I have to find even more time to do it. So, like I said, publishing especially, that just, you never run out of tasks. It just is such a overwhelming job, but it's fun. So, I mean, definitely it's harder to write scripts since I took over publishing. So that's why those bleed more into into weekend work, or, I'll do an evening when the kids have gone to bed or something and I've, had a bunch of coffee. But yeah, I'll always make time for it. And I mean, even in my spare time outside of Wayforward, the projects I do tend to be book related. I've done a couple of children's books. I'm working on a comic book right now. So, anything, I'm a writer at heart more than anything. So I'll always find time to write.
Okay. And does that aspect change when it's something like Yards Recharged, which is something that that's being published by Atari?
It's definitely more collaborative, for sure. So yeah, like when we're doing something where it's just, our internal thing, like Cat Girl Without Salad is one that I wrote. Like, you could just do whatever you want. We're just kind of collaborating internally, and we really only have to get the approvals of Matt Bozon, our creative director. With something like Yars Rising, because we're working with Atari, because it's not our brand, you definitely need to get more approval. So probably the difference is you're checking in at each stage. So it's like, here's our plot, and then they'll give feedback on that. And then here's the individual scenes, and they'll give feedback on that. And then here's a first pass of the dialogue, and they'll give feedback on that. So it's kind of more checking in along the way to make sure that you don't go really off the rails and waste your time, coming up with something that they're not going to like and they're not going to use. But that's just kind of, in terms of the check-in process. I think the actual process of just sitting down and writing it is pretty much the same. I'm sure every writer has their own, different ways that they go about it, but mine have been evolving ever since I came to Wayforward, but they're not too different now than, back when I was writing in high school.
Now, you mentioned that your favorite part of writing is dialogue. What's your least favorite?
I guess, when we write the scripts for the games, it's pretty much all dialogue, because everything else we write goes into what's called a GDD, a game design document. And you can think of that as that's like the screenplay of the game. So it's like a game director will write a GDD, and it'll list every enemy and how the enemies attack and how much health they have and what the levels are and the bosses. It's basically just kind of dumping from their head everything that everyone's going to work on for the next year to 2 years in the game. I would say definitely the least interesting is the HUD stuff, is the menu stuff. So it all has to be written. Every game is slightly different. But yeah, when you're writing 100-page GDD, when you get to that section where it's all right, I'm going to talk about health meters, and I'm going to talk about EXP, and I'm going to talk about leveling, and I'm going to talk about how you pause and unpause the game and how you scroll through inventory. That's the stuff that, if you're doing something very interesting aesthetically, that could be cool, but usually that's on the least interesting end of the spectrum, at least for me, on writing on game.
Yeah, you probably don't really care what all happens when you pause, what still keeps rolling and what doesn't. You just want to know the story layout.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just covering a lot of kind of mechanical stuff, or we'll write up what's called boot sequences, and so that's okay, when you start the game, how long do you display each logo? What is the order of logos? If you press the button, does it speed the logos up or does it not? A lot of that stuff, it needs to be written so that the programmers can implement it, but it's not the most interesting stuff, for sure.
Yeah.
It's not the most interesting stuff, but it's some of the most latently important, UI, UX
Oh yeah, for sure. And especially when you get into like the mobile space. If you do any mobile games, if you have
Uh-huh.
bad UI or if you have a bad menu flow or it takes you too long to get into the gameplay, people will just immediately stop playing.
Or even like
Yeah.
with logos and stuff like that, if you're licensing something, part of the license agreement, it has to stay on for a set amount of time before they can even skip it. Or you
Yeah,
can
that
get in
stuff
hot
is always
water with that.
tricky. We try
Yeah.
to skip that stuff as much as possible. What we did on River City Girls that I thought worked well is anything that was like a cinematic or an intro sequence or a motion comic or a cutscene, any of that stuff, you could basically hold down the button. You hold it down for, I think it was about a second, and a little meter would fill up and then it would skip it. And the reason we liked that is we want people to be able to jump right to the gameplay if they want. But on the other end, we don't want one of those things where someone who's really into the plot or the story or the dialogue or whatever to accidentally skip it, because
Right.
we've all done that, and that's horrible when you're actually wrapped up in a game and you think you're pressing A to jump to a story thing and it just jumps over all the story. And in a lot of games there's never a way to get back to that, so you're like, oh crap, I guess I'll go look on YouTube or something. So we're trying to always kind of find a good balance between those two.
At least
Right.
there's the option to do that these days. I've done that like back in the PlayStation 2 days.
Yeah,
And,
at this point, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a Wayforward game without some degree of speed up or something. Just because I think it's obnoxious to force people to look at every second of your game, just because you think it's all important. Different things are important to different people. I remember we were lucky enough to work with Nintendo on Advance Wars. We did the remake of Advance Wars 1 and 2 on Nintendo Switch, and one of the features that we added, the director James added, was a fast forward element, and I just thought that was great. Like, it wasn't totally skipping stuff, but it's just like, hey, there's a lot of stuff going on. If you want to see everything, but you just want it to go fast forward, kind of like listening to a podcast at double speed, it was there.
And I'm taking that Nintendo was fine with this.
Yeah, we didn't change too much in the game. We obviously it has updated visuals and it's not pixel art anymore, but yeah, they were pretty open to a lot of the little suggestions we had, and some of it came from them too, because really both sides, Nintendo and WayForward, we both wanted to modernize it in a way that was satisfying, but also that didn't get rid of the nostalgia, because I think you definitely can over modernize a game if you're not careful.
It's come up. Like, it's something. Yeah, it's something that's been talked about on our show quite a bit, because we know a lot of people who do retro remasters and that sort of thing. And it's always a balancing act.
Yeah, the way we always try to approach it is we try to make it so that you're, especially with like a remake where we're trying to, kind of keep the game sort of intact, like DuckTales Remastered, for example. The game that people remember is never exactly the game that it was. So we try to more recreate the game that they remember. So it's kind of like we're creating the ultimate version that you think you remember playing. What you actually played, maybe it was a little bit rougher, maybe it was much shorter, maybe it was, a little bit more janky on the controls or something. So we're always trying to kind of look for like what is the ultimate version whenever we do a remake of or a remaster, and that's not always to just copy it exactly. I think that's not usually the solution. We really kind of go through it piece by piece and decide what to modernize and what to keep the same.
I will say DuckTales Remastered was definitely not the game I remember. Like, it's just there's a lot more modern cutscenes and dialogue in DuckTales Remastered, whereas you could literally not have that stuff in an NES game.
Yeah, hard to fit a lot of dialogue onto the cartridge.
And that was one also where we were kind of stylistically trying to do something that was like 50% DuckTales, the NES game, and 50% DuckTales, the cartoon, because we were working with, the animation style, the cartoon, all the voice actors. So thematically, we weren't just going in a different direction like we were on something like like a River City Girls or something. We wanted to kind of marry those two things that people really love, so it was a lot of like careful choices within that regard, because even for example like Scrooge McDuck doesn't have the same proportions or the same design between the cartoon and the game, so we had to kind of do a lot of amalgams or a lot of kind of choosing A versus B on that stuff.
I'd imagine. It's especially tricky with something like DuckTales, which is a very beloved property, both in the sense of the cartoon and the game.
Exactly. Yeah. We had people coming from a love of both, or people that only knew one or the other.
I'm like, but I think you hit the through line well enough. I can't say I liked every aspect of DuckTales Remastered, but
We tried. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Anyway, shifting back to more modern times, I suppose we should talk about some of Wayforward's recent releases. And
Sure.
Though I'm not sure how much you could talk about, say, Contra Operation Beluga, since that was in collaboration with Konami, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I can always talk. There's games that we have to, be a little more, can't expose quite as much about the process. Contra would be a little bit like that. Definitely working with Nintendo on Advance Wars. We can't get too deep on that stuff. But no, I mean, feel free, ask away. You can ask any questions. Worst thing is I might just be able to say I can't answer something.
Fair enough. Well, I mean, the thing I've been wondering since you worked on Contra 4, is how do you think this new Contra compares to the one you did back in 2007?
Oh, I loved it. And so, I mean, and I can say that without too much bias because I really didn't work on this one other than, helping out with the biz dev and the marketing. But no, I mean, we were talking with Konami about a bunch of different opportunities, and this was shortly after they had come up with the last Contra game, which was the kind of really weird one with the panda bear and all that, and they were really kind of getting pretty experimental on it. And I think because that one wasn't, universally beloved by fans, there was kind of a desire to, well, maybe let's get back to the basics. And that's basically what we did, 15, 20 years ago with Contra 4, is they had tried a bunch of stuff on the PlayStation consoles and on, different versions of the game. And everybody was like, I just like Contra. I just want that, that first NES game, that first arcade game. Like, that's what we want. So back in the mid 2000s, that's what we did with Contra 4, and then that was our approach with this one. Obviously, it's updated. All of the art is fully 3D, even though the gameplay is 2D. But I remember we do a lot of internal reviews as we're developing them, and when Tom, the director, showed us the first prototype, everybody was like, yeah, it just feels right. Like, it feels like Contra. And I think it's just because, he nailed the mobility, he nailed the way you jump and the way you shoot. Everything just felt very, very similar to what we did on Contra 4 and what they did on the first few games. And I think that's kind of why Konami came to Wayforward, because we were the ones to do that. I think if they had wanted to do something else, if it was like, oh, let's do Contra as like a Souls game or something like that, they could have gone to anyone else. But when they wanted something where it's like, we want to have it feel like that really the Contra 4 was kind of the last big one that felt like a traditional game, so we were the obvious choices to get back to that. But yeah, I was very happy with how it came out, and right from the first playable it felt right.
I mean, I haven't played it yet, so I couldn't speak to the game personally, but I do remember enjoying Contra 4 quite a bit back in the day. In fact, I think I still have my copy of Contra 4 somewhere in storage.
Yeah, they feel very similar in terms of the gameplay, just very updated visuals, different effects, and then also all the weapons feel great. So I mean, you play the NES Contra and you rush to get a spread shot and you do not want the laser and some of the other weapons. We've rebalanced that stuff. So now pretty much everything is great, even the guns that you might have tried to avoid in the earlier titles.
That does bring me back to Contra 1 on the NES. It was like spread shots, maybe machine gun or laser in a pinch, never the fireball.
Yep. Yeah, the flamethrower is really good on the new one too. Again, I'm biased. I work for the company, but I think they're great. And the homing missiles, I love using those, just because I'm lazy and I like to kill enemies without aiming at them. But yeah, there's a lot of nice stuff, and I know that there's also systems in there where you can double stack them. There's systems where different players use the weapons differently. They have different feels. They've got the system where you can destroy the weapons and get like a one-time boost. So there's a lot of cool depth to the weapon system in this one that wasn't in any of the games before.
Good to know. And I suppose I should ask about the Switch version, given the reviews that have reported that it's been having some trouble there in terms of performance.
Yeah, it's just tricky. We develop for all the different consoles and PC, and you're going to get differences based on the capabilities of the systems. And so sometimes there's no major differences. Sometimes it's identical between them all. I remember we had a little bit of limitations on the River City Girls 2 with the Switch version as well. So, we always try and do our best. We always try and find kind of a good middle ground to keep the experience as similar as possible across all the systems. We don't want to do something where it feels like we're doing the lowest common denominator, and then so the higher end consoles don't feel like a modern game. At the other time, we don't want to do something where one console leaves the other one in the dirt. And but it's something we're always trying to improve. And also there was a big difference, I think, maybe not everyone's aware, between the Switch demo that was initially released and then where the game is now with the week 1 patch. And so definitely anybody who played it on Switch when it was released as a demo and hasn't played the final version that's commercially available on Switch, there were some improvements made there as well, because we're always going to come back to a game. We're always going to do everything we can to make the play experience as good as possible for everybody.
Good to know. Anyway, so shifting forward, suppose this is a good time to talk about Yars Rising, which is a very curious reinterpretation of the Yars franchise, in that it's like a side-scrolling action game now.
It is, yes. So that was we were talking to Atari. We had worked with them a little bit in the past. We did the Centipede game that you mentioned about a decade ago. But we were talking to them, talking to their new CEO Wade, and wanting to work together. And as we were putting pitches together, sometimes our pitches are pretty faithful to the original game. Sometimes they get kind of out there. And for whatever reason, we kind of came up with this main character, Emi Kimura, and her story as a hacker and her kind of, whole thing. And it made sense to us to, rather than just remain in the parameters of the original game, which was the Yars aliens versus the Kotile and the intergalactic battle, to do something that had a different structure to it as well. However, I will say we're not replacing that stuff. So you can see a little bit of it in the trailer, but as we market the game, and as it becomes available for play at trade shows and stuff like that, you'll see we're not erasing anything from the original game. We're just building a new, bigger story around it, and one that has more of an Earth component. And as you get deeper into the game, a lot of the lore and a lot of the systems and the characters and stuff from that original Atari 2600 game carry over. And you can see a tiny bit in the trailer, but all of the original gameplay is also intact. It's just that we're putting that into basically her hacking system. So the way that Emmy, when she is hacking into a computer, you're essentially playing these little mini games that look like Yar's Revenge, that look like other homages to Atari games. So that's kind of how we wove that into the lore, rather than, we didn't want to do the approach where it's just 100% flying bug shooter. We wanted to do something where it had a little more kind of like grounded style to it. So hopefully people like it. I mean, if they give it a chance, I think it's some of the best character work we've ever done. It's a really solid Metroidvania. It's got a great story. It's got great dialogue. It's got great gameplay. The art direction, I think, is fantastic. I think people will really like it. And if you are a hardcore Atari or Yar's Revenge fan, there is copious amounts of lore and nods to those the classic game and the classic even the freebie comic and stuff like that. There's a lot that we're tapping into.
I mean, I gotta admit, when I think of deep lore and all that stuff, I don't really think of Yar's Revenge.
Yeah, a lot of it came from the ancillary materials. So you play the game and it's just kind of abstract visuals, which was, like a lot of Atari games at the time. But they shipped a little mini comic book back then with the game. And that had, you saw the Yar aliens, you saw their plight, and you saw them fighting the Kotai, all this stuff. Was the basis for a lot of what we kind of wove into the plot as far as the sci-fi side. But yeah, it was most of it was out of game just because they really couldn't do a lot of story display within game way back.
The Zorlon canon, it's all.
Yep, exactly.
Makes me wonder if you're going to be drawing from like Yar's like Recharged, or which is like the new Yar's game that they put out.
Yep. We looked at everything, so I really just helped with the story. James Montagna, the director, the designer director, he might have pulled in elements from the games that have happened since then. There was also the Xbox 360 game, which was more kind of fantasy setting. I'm sure that he looked at all of those and looked for little elements and Easter eggs and stuff to carry over. But I know that mostly it was really tapping into that first 2600 game, as far as pulling everything we possibly could out of that and making sure that was all represented here.
Makes sense, since when you think of Yar's Revenge, you're thinking of the Atari 2600. Let's be honest here.
Yeah, and kind of an unusual one in that a lot of those old Atari games were not 2600 exclusive. A lot of them had arcade components, but yours was one of the few where it only existed as that 2600 game.
It is the highest selling original Atari 2600 game.
Yeah, that's not surprising. I love it. I love everything by Howard Scott Warshaw, the guy who created it. He also did the Raiders of the Lost Ark game and the infamous E.T. game, which I also like that. But all three of his games are so just ambitious for the time, and really tried to create worlds and create stories in a way that I think most of the other games were not.
Yeah, they certainly were ambitious. I don't like E.T. I absolutely hate Raiders of the Lost Ark.
It's so abstract. If you don't know what's going on, if you just turned it on, I have no idea what's going on. But once you have to kind of be explained outside of the game, like, oh, now you're in the black market, now you're falling onto the plateaus with the tsetse flies, and it's almost like you need a guidebook to go through it. But that is one of my favorite games just because it is so ambitious.
Yeah, it's like a point-and-click adventure game rendered into a Atari 2600. All that entails. Like,
Yeah, very much so.
and let's see, we also have Shantae Advance. Shantae is returning here soon.
He is. Matt is working on that right now, and yeah, that was an interesting one. So the original game existed before I even got to Wayforward. I remember the first few times I visited the studio, I got to play Shantae Advance with Matt. We got to do the little multiplayer mode, and it is so awesome that over 20 years later, he's now getting to finish it with limited run. And it's cool. When the first couple games I worked on at Wayforward were Game Boy Advance, and I think that was the last time that we really had like very limited color palettes, very limited, sprite sizes. Like once you move to the DS and 3DS and Wii, you can kind of do whatever you want at that point. But there's such a charm to GBA games, and so I know he's just having the time of his life, finishing that game up and working from what he did 20 plus years ago. And everything I've seen on it so far looks really, really exciting and really fantastic. So I think fans are going to be excited about that one. There's the GBA version, which was the cart that you could buy via LRG, but then of course, like all of our Port Plus games, like River City Zero and Extreme Sports and Shantae One and Clock Tower Rewind, it's going to come to all the other major consoles as well in the future.
Yeah.
Now, this is one thing I was a little bit unclear about that. Even though I did get it, I ordered it from Limited Run. Is that pretty much the ideas as they were back when it was originally created, or has it been like significantly like new ideas have happened over time and those have been included?
Well, I think it is mostly. I'm sure that there was some new stuff that was recreated, but it's not faking it. It's not just like, hey, let's make a GBA game in 2024 and pretend that it's like latched onto this one. The original demo was over an hour long and really had a lot of gameplay concepts that did make it into this one. And looking at tech like the diving and swimming tech and the rotating worlds and all that stuff, that was all back then. And so I'm sure that Matt probably has kind of tweaked his decisions on some of the enemies and bosses, but yeah, for the most part, largely he is just trying to realize the game that he didn't get to 20 years ago, because we did Shantae 1 was on Game Boy Color and it was slightly better if you played on Game Boy Advance, and then the next game we released was Risky's Revenge, which I believe was DSiWare. So we skipped over the GBA one. Again, it was like slightly before I came to Wayforward, so I'm not sure exactly why we stopped working on that one and switched over to Risky's Revenge. But it was a completely different game, completely different story, and yeah, he's finally finishing it up now. And the other thing is, yeah, for anybody who ordered it, like, since there really is there's no way to distribute, there's no market for distributing GBA digital games at this point, so the people who want to play the pure GBA version, that was the way to do it. Anybody who ordered the game from Limited Run and has one of those GBA carts coming, that is like the purest, most basic GBA form of the game before we start porting it to consoles for the wider digital release.
Mm-hmm.
Actually being ported, it's not like you're gonna send people a ROM that they plug into a Game Boy emulator, right?
No, it's going to be the same as like we did with River City Girls Zero. We're doing Clock Tower right now. We did previously with Shantae 1 and Extreme Sports, and so it's going to run on those systems. There's going to be some adjustments, like you could see in the Switch announcement trailer, which was part of one of the Indie Worlds with Nintendo. The character portraits get high resolution, so there's little bits and pieces that change it, evolve it beyond just the GBA version for that.
Fair enough.
Yes. And as riveting as all of this is, unfortunately, our time is running low here. But we certainly would like to have you back when more Wayforward projects get announced.
Of course, yeah, and I mean, we would love to have the individual directors too. So let's coordinate.
Yeah.
I'd love to have James on your show to talk about Yars Rising, and Matt
We've
to talk
actually
about
had
Shantae.
Yeah,
yeah, we
like,
had we had James on the program about 5 years ago.
Oh, cool.
it's a
so-
small world after
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
We'd love to have him back, and that's part of what I help with in the publishing is
Yeah.
marketing and press and all that. So yeah, hit us up. Anybody that you guys would be interested in having, any game that you'd be interested in, doing an interview focused around, we're always happy to set that up.
Sure. Probably, I'll probably do that in the days ahead.
Especially because
but
we start
in the
billing next season.
Yeah.
One of the really interesting ones we have on the horizon is Clock Tower Rewind. I've mentioned that a few times. So the original Clock Tower on Super Nintendo never actually came out in the West. There is no official Super Nintendo version. So we're working on that right now. It's coming out really good. The project lead on that is Mariel Cartwright, who we've worked with a bunch. She comes from Skullgirls and Indivisible and a lot of these kind of other non-Wayforward games that they have a similar feel. Yeah, we definitely want to get the word out on that game when it comes out later this year. So
we'll probably be talking about Clock Tower with limited run in a few weeks.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, I mean, they're slated for May 10th, according to our calendar. So,
cool. Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Yeah. But anyway, we got to move to the next segment. Petty, can you play us to there?
Sure. 1 second.
All right, so welcome to the topic of discussion. This week we are talking about the original Game Boy, as it celebrates its 35th anniversary. I'm like, yes, you have permission to feel old. Now, granted, even though the Game Boy is turning 35, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who is engaged with the Game Boy is of that age. Because one of the things about the Game Boy is it had a very long life.
Yeah, especially for an active life.
Yeah. Like, even if you don't want to include the Game Boy Color into the mix, I mean, that is a discussion in its own right. You can chart, the original Game Boy's lifespan is about a decade old. And even into the Game Boy Color, there were tons of Game Boy Color compatible cartridges that still played on the original Game Boy.
Yep.
Right up to the Game Boy Advance's launch.
Indeed.
So the point is, even if you got a Game Boy in, say, 1989, there's a very good chance, your younger sibling who was, a kid in, say, 1997 was still, not necessarily on the same Game Boy, because there was a lot of revisions to the Game Boy over the years. Chief among them was the Game Boy Pocket.
Indeed.
Which came around in, I want to say, 94 or something like that.
Yeah, and I believe the big one with that is
which dramatically reduced the Game Boy's size and power consumption even further.
And they also changed the screen slightly.
Slightly, but
it's not green; it's gray.
Yeah, I was about to say it's enough that if you have them side by side, you would notice. But
no, you would notice mainly because of the color. Like, it ditched that cute green look for grayscale.
Yeah.
Because.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Because that was one of the defining features of the Game Boy. That particular shade of green.
Indeed.
In fact, in fact, the Sega Game Gear, one of the commercials launched a attack campaign against the Game Boy on those terms. Calling it like cream spinach color. Or something.
90s advertising was weird.
90s advertising was fucking aggressive.
That's a valid complaint, or I guess observation.
Yeah, I mean, it could get weird sometimes, but like 1990s advertising is just the epitome of in your face, which was the style at the time. But we're getting off base here.
Fair.
And
I guess part of the Game Boy's long life is the shot in an arm it's got from Pokemon.
Very strange, because like Pokemon comes in at the especially in the West, the tail end of the original Game Boy.
Yeah, the Game Boy was literally on the way out at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like it launches the same year as a Game Boy Color. Indeed, when I got a Game Boy Color, I had Pokemon Blue. I didn't play it much because I was a teenager by then, and Pokemon just did not click with me. And keep in mind, I was very much into role-playing games.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's because A, I just wasn't the age for it, and B, I didn't have anyone to trade with.
Right.
Definitely
having a sibling helped, even if they weren't that super excited about it.
Yeah. Definitely played a lot more of Link's Awakening DX and Super Mario Brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And it is worth noting that because they knew that they were getting the technology upgrades, later basic Game Boy games still had like custom color palettes.
Yeah.
That they'd use if you put them in a Game Boy Color or a Super Game Boy.
Yeah, that dates all the way back to the Super Game Boy, which launched in 1994. Which it was a very curious item. It was basically a Game Boy on your Super Nintendo.
It is literally an entire Game Boy hardware, except instead of a screen, it has a video out.
Yeah,
and a little bit of a home screen type stuff that you can use to edit palettes and stuff, and the border.
Mm.
Yeah,
and then that made into a Super Nintendo cartridge.
Yeah, but if you want the ultimate console game playing device, the Game Boy Player on the GameCube.
Yep, that will play everything.
Yep,
that did play classic Game Boy games.
Yes.
Yep, and Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance.
Okay, because I had heard somewhat persistent rumors that you could use the Game Boy Player to get Pokemon from the first two generations into the Gen 3 game. It didn't work, but I'd heard persistent rumors.
The thing that you would need for that, like, no, it would be the Game Boy Player. No, I'm thinking of the Game Boy. There was also a Super Game Boy 2.
The Game Boy Player could have worked. The problem is that there are internal data structure problems between the two generations, Generation 2 and Gen 3.
What I was hearing how they would do it back in the day, I can't confirm any of this, is they would use the player to get the actual data, and then with like some sort of like homebrew program would generate an exact copy in the modern.
Theoretically possible.
Yeah,
I guess. Yeah. I mean, you can also just create them from scratch.
Yeah, but that's if you want your Blastoise from Pokemon Blue, I could see somebody at least generating a copy.
Yeah, the only versions of Gen 1 and 2 Pokemon that are actually able to come forward is from the Virtual Console versions.
Right.
And in those ones, about 80% of the data is just made up.
Yeah. They just basically regen it on the game when you send it to bank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like, anyway, also worth mentioning is the Game Boy Light. That very curious product.
The Light didn't come out in US, did it?
Yeah, I think that was Japan only, but it did answer one of the... the Game Boy screen was like it was for a reason, namely that it was extremely cheap and had very low power drain. But the result of that is that it was useless in the dark and, in fact, most actual lighting conditions. So they did actually make a original Game Boy with a light on it in Japan.
Yeah. 6 months before the Game Boy Color came out.
Oof.
In fairness, the Game Boy Color is also not backlit.
No, but
but here's the wrinkle to that. Go ahead, Adam. You're probably going to touch the same point I was.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. Even backlit, nobody was going to buy the black and white unit when the color unit was out.
Well, that's true.
Something else is the way that the Color Game Boy screen was made. It's not black backlight mod compatible like the original DMG and the Pocket.
Mm.
You have to put a brand
Advance
new...
that wasn't, but Color might be too.
I believe it was the Color. I think the Advance was one that could be modded for the backlight. I think you can actually mod in...
Because the Advance SP doesn't use a backlight; it uses a front light.
There was I guess the third generation of the SP, I believe, was backlit.
Maybe.
And people are modding those screens into the old Advance because the pinouts are there.
Yeah. Like, anyway, yeah, there's just so much to the original Game Boy. Like,
I mean, it managed to be not literally no competition, but basically no significant competition for a very long time, in spite of being pretty low specs. And the reason it was able to do that is because they really focused on it being able to do a relatively specific number of things very well.
Yeah, so the Game Boy is probably the apotheosis of Nintendo's withered technology strategy. And this is something that was a top philosophy of Gunpei Yokoi, who very much believed in not necessarily always going for the cutting edge stuff, but rather making the best possible use of older technology that, while maybe not very powerful or what have you, can be very cost efficient.
Yeah, hence why this, coming back to that, the Switch is currently the cheapest current gen console.
Like,
even though it's running a chip from about 2012?
Yeah, well, that's mainly because the Switch has been on the market for 7 years at this point.
But I mean, the Switch's chip wasn't new when the Switch came out, was what I'm saying.
Right, but it's also the Switch, when it came out, wasn't nearly as outdated as the Game Boy was in 1989.
Fair.
There
was the Lynx, right? Was a portable system with interchangeable game cartridges, and it had a color screen, and it came out like within a couple of months of the Game Boy. But we don't all play Atari Lynxes these days.
Well, not just that, but the original Game Boy's CPU is a custom job based off of the Zilog Z80, which is a chip that powered consoles at the beginning of the 1980s.
Right.
We're talking like the SG-1000 at most. It's like, consoles that came out in like 1981 and computers of that age. And, by the time we get to the 1989, it's like, not only is this very outdated, but here's the key. It's cheap as dirt. And it's very well known. It's not Nintendo reaching out and grabbing something that's obscure, like they did with the NES, ironically enough. I mean, the NES was much more, technologically capable in 1983, but it's was based off of the CMOS chip, which was unusual for a Japanese system.
Or like the chip that powers the Wii U, the Power PC,
Power PC,
which was really only seen on about 4 or 5 generations of Macs at the time.
something like that. I mean, look, the Wii U was just a bevy of bad design choices.
Oh God, yes.
But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the Game Boy, which, has a shitty screen, let's be honest here.
Yes.
Um,
And it's getting worse with age because...
Well, that's just because of age.
Yeah.
That's because the glue is literally drying on that shit.
Mm-hmm.
But, that was not really concern of, let's say, 1989 Nintendo.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they were too worried about where the Game Boy was going to be in 35 years.
Yeah, I assume they would be relatively surprised if they knew that there were still people who would want to play original Game Boys in 30 years.
Mm-hmm. And let's be honest, don't play an original Game Boy.
Yeah, unless you really prefer the heftiness or you want something that can survive potentially being literally bombed. There are literally 3 or 4 hardware iterations, depending on how you count, that can play literally everything that the Game Boy can play.
I would say, like in an analog pocket NT or something that, because the patents on that thing have expired.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and I wasn't even talking about like those. I'm talking about like literally, if you get like a used Game Boy Advance, it can play original Game Boy games.
Yeah, I mean, like I guess if you want to say real hardware, a Game Boy Advance SP.
Yes.
It's like because of that non-backlit screen, there was just an absolute industry of peripherals. I know because I had both the, I'm trying to remember, like the Light Boy, I think it was called.
Yeah.
It was a thing that, like, you literally put it on and it had a light on the screen.
Yeah, it connected to your
They
link
had
point.
many different form factors of way to have a built-in battery-powered light focus on the screen.
Yeah. And also, I had, I didn't use it as often because it was bulky, as opposed to having the light, which wasn't that intrusive. But, the magnifying glass. Remember this?
Yeah, like
also
20
screen
different
tiny.
ones of those.
Mm-hmm. Like I said, just there were no shortage of these things for the Game Boy. Anyway, as much as I would like to continue talking about the Game Boy,
we barely talked about the games on it at all.
Just time is getting low here.
Yeah.
But,
right.
So we'll talk about the Game Boy games next week. I think. Yeah, probably, I think that'll work. Right. Anyway, so unfortunately, we have to wrap it up here, as we got to prepare for the season finale of Moonhawk Studios Presents.
Woo!
Right. But coming up on the week ahead, in terms of Fragments of Silicon, if I can get to the right. Anyway, coming up on Friday, April 26th, we'll be having Renee Gittins of Stumbling Cat. We will be talking about potions. Trying to remember the subtitle here, if I can find the right. When you have too many tabs. Here we go. Potions, A Curious Tale. If you recall, this is actually the game that gained a bit of notoriety by being buried by a bunch of EA classics and subsequently getting a lot of attention for it. Weird how these things work out. Anyway, and coming up on the Sunday reviews, we'll be having reviews of Delta V, Rings of Saturn, Ley Lantern and Gynoog, Classic Shmups Pack, Pools, and Yogurt Commercial 3. So, until next time, I shall wish you good gaming. Ooh.